There is a feeling, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not sadness exactly. It's not anxiety exactly. It's something quieter than both of those. It's the feeling of being in motion, constantly in motion, and yet somehow going nowhere. Like you're running on a treadmill at full speed and the scenery never changes. You're doing everything right. You're showing up, you're trying, you're praying, and somewhere beneath all of that doing, beneath all of that good, faithful effort, there is this voice, small, almost polite, and it says, "Is any of this actually working?" You don't say it out loud, you barely let yourself think it, but it's there. And here's what I find remarkable, what I find almost impossible to dismiss, is that Jesus addressed this feeling directly. Not indirectly, not metaphorically, not in a parable that requires 3 seminary degrees to unpack. Directly. He saw this specific feeling coming. He knew it would follow his followers like a shadow. And he said something about it that most people have read 100 times and still missed entirely. Because the word that changes everything in what he said, I'm going to tell you what it is, but not yet. Because if I tell you now, it won't mean what it's supposed to mean. There's a door you have to walk through first. Stay with me. There's something else you need to know before we get there. Something about the moment Jesus said this. About where he was, who was around him, what the air felt like, what the people listening to him were actually carrying. Because context in scripture is never decoration. Context is the meaning. And what was happening the day Jesus said these words, what was happening in the lives of the people standing there, it mirrors something that might be happening in your life right now so precisely that it will feel like it was written for you. Because, and I genuinely believe this, it was. So hold that. Hold 2 things. The word we'll get to and the moment we're about to enter. Both of them are going to matter. The scene is this. A crowd, a large one, and Jesus has been teaching, the kind of teaching that makes people forget they're hungry, forget how long they've been standing, the kind of words that get inside you and rearrange things. And in the middle of this crowd, there are 2 very different kinds of people. There are people who are curious, interested, intrigued by this rabbi who speaks with authority that feels different from anything they've heard before. And then there are people who are desperate. Not dramatically desperate, not falling on the ground desperate, quietly desperate, the kind of desperate that looks like everyone else on the outside, the kind of desperate that goes home at night and lies in the dark and wonders whether God is actually paying attention, whether their prayers are reaching anything other than the ceiling. These are the people Jesus is looking at when he says it. And here's what most people think he's saying. Most readings of this passage go something like this. Jesus is giving advice about priorities. He's saying, don't get so caught up in the demands of daily life that you forget what matters. Seek the kingdom first. Put God before your to-do list. Make time for the spiritual. That's the common reading. That's the beautiful, true, good reading that has helped millions of people. But here's the thing, and I need you to stay with me here, that reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete because there is one word, one single word in the original Greek text that most English translations smooth over, and in smoothing it over, they accidentally remove the most urgent piece of what Jesus is actually saying. The word is merimnao, and here's what's remarkable about it. In 1947, in Cave 4 at Qumran, the same cave complex that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars discovered manuscript fragments that used this word in a way that had been lost to common interpretation for nearly 2,000 years. The word doesn't just mean worry. It doesn't just mean anxiety in the modern therapeutic sense. The root of merimnao is the word merizomai, and that root means to divide, to be split, to be pulled in 2 directions simultaneously by 2 things that both feel equally real, equally urgent, equally demanding. This is not about people who are distracted by Netflix. This is not about people who forgot to read their Bible this morning. This is about people who are being divided, people whose hearts have been cut down the middle, half of them trusting, half of them terrified. And Jesus looked at those people, those specific people, and he didn't give them a productivity tip. He gave them something else entirely, something we're going to get to. But first, why does he describe this feeling the way he does? Why these specific images? Why these particular words? There's a reason, and it goes all the way back to something that happened hundreds of years before Jesus was born. Something the people in that crowd would have recognized immediately. a story they'd grown up with, a story that lived in their bodies, that Jesus was deliberately invoking. And when you see what that story is, everything about this passage reshapes itself. She is in the desert. Her name is Hagar, and she is completely, terrifyingly alone. She has a child, her son, Ishmael, and he is sick, and she has run out of water, and she has done something that only a parent at the absolute end of their strength could do. She has placed her son under a bush, gently, carefully, and she has walked away, not far, just far enough that she cannot see his face, because she cannot watch him die. She sits down and she weeps, not pretty tears, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than the lungs, the kind that shakes the whole body. She is not praying exactly. She is not quoting scripture. She is simply broken, exposed, used up. And then something happens that I think about more than almost anything else in the entire Bible. God speaks to her, not to Abraham, not to Isaac, not to the great patriarch of the story, to her, to the slave woman, to the one who has been sent away, to the one who, by every measure of that culture, counted for nothing. And the first thing God says to her, and the first thing is not an answer. It's a question. What ails you, Hagar? Which is striking, isn't it? Because God is not asking because he doesn't know. God is asking because she needs to say it. Because something happens when we name the thing that is breaking us. Something shifts. Something becomes real in a different way. The question is an act of love. The question is the presence of God refusing to skip past her pain to get to the point. And then God says something that stops me every time. He says, I have heard the voice of the boy, which means even when Hagar had stopped hoping, even when she had walked away from her own child because hope had become too painful to hold, God had not stopped listening. God was tracking the breath of a child that his own mother could no longer bear to watch. Now, here's why this matters for what Jesus says. Because Jesus, raised in the synagogue, steeped in Torah, surrounded by people who knew these stories by heart, Jesus knew that every time he spoke about worry, about division, about the feeling of being pulled apart by fear and faith simultaneously, his listeners were hearing Hagar's name underneath his words. They were hearing the desert. They were hearing the mother who walked away. And they were hearing what came after, but we're not there yet. Because there's a complication. There's something about what Jesus says, something about the specific instruction he gives, that most people, even people who love this passage, fundamentally misunderstand. And the misunderstanding is not small. It changes what you're supposed to do with what he says. And if you have been carrying something for a long time, if you are someone who has been faithful, who has been showing up, who has been trusting God and trying hard and doing everything you know to do, and the thing you've been praying about still hasn't moved, then this next piece is the reason you're watching this today. Not as a figure of speech. I genuinely believe that. Because the command Jesus gives, the actual command, the verb, the imperative he uses, is not what you think it is. Most people read this passage and hear Jesus saying, stop worrying, which makes sense grammatically, which makes sense in English. But in the Greek, in the specific tense and mood of the verb, Jesus is not saying, don't worry. He is saying, stop. As in, you are currently doing this. You are in the middle of this right now. I am not warning you about a future habit. I am interrupting an ongoing action. The tense is present imperative. It means cease what you are already doing this very moment, which means Jesus is not looking at people who might worry someday. He's looking at people who are already divided, already split, already in the middle of the very feeling that brought them to this crowd in the first place. He's looking at people who are gripping two things at once, their faith and their fear, and he's saying, with tremendous tenderness, you can put one of those down now. But here's what's so extraordinary, and this is the layer underneath the layer. He doesn't tell them to put down the fear by mustering more faith. He doesn't say, try harder. He doesn't say, believe more, leave. He doesn't give them a spiritual technique or a mental exercise or a 5-step framework. He redirects their gaze. Look at the birds, he says. Look at the lilies. And I want to sit in this for a moment because Jesus, the Son of God, the one through whom all things were made, is pointing at birds. Common sparrows, the kind nobody notices, the kind that flock by the hundreds and you barely see them individually. He's pointing at flowers that grow in ditches and hillsides, flowers that will be gone in a week. Why? Why not point at something majestic? Why not point at the stars, at the grandeur of creation, at the cosmos, at evidence of divine power on a grand scale? Why these small things? Because the person who is divided, the person who is Mary now, has stopped seeing what's right in front of them. They are living in two places at once, in the feared future and in the anxious present. They are not here. Their eyes work, but they are not seeing. And Jesus is doing something almost therapeutic in the deepest sense of the word. He is saying, come back to now. Come back to this moment. Look at what is actually in front of you. The birds are in front of you, and the birds are fed. Not because they figured out a plan, not because they solved their food problem, not because they worked harder or worried smarter. They are fed because they exist within a system of care that they didn't build and don't manage. They simply live and are provided for. And Jesus says, you are worth more than many sparrows, which sounds like comfort, and it is. But there is a word in that sentence, pollen, that in the Greek doesn't just mean many. It carries a sense of incomparably more. The kind of more that closes the argument, the kind of more that makes the comparison almost absurd. You are not slightly more valuable than a sparrow. The distance between your value in God's sight and a sparrow's value is so vast that the comparison itself is almost laughable. And yet, here's the complication, the one that brings us to the darkest and most honest part of this conversation, if that's true. If you are incomparably, immeasurably, absurdly more valuable to God than the birds he feeds without fail, then why are there so many people who love God, who trust God, who have given their lives to God, whose needs are not obviously being met, whose prayers seem to go unanswered, whose deserts stretch on and on without a voice, without a well, without a word? Why does the logic work for the birds and seem to break for them? This is the question I have heard more than any other. In conversations, in comments, in messages at 2 a.m. from people who are not doubting God. They're not abandoning their faith. They are just tired. They are divided. They are merim now. And they need something more than trust God, said brightly by someone who doesn't know what they're carrying. So let's go there. There is a theological word for what we're describing. The word is desolation. It's a word used by the mystics, by people like John of the Cross, by Ignatius of Loyola, to describe the experience of spiritual darkness that follows genuine devotion. The night that comes not to people who have abandoned God, but specifically, precisely, almost exclusively to people who are trying to follow him closely. John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul, but what most people don't know, what gets lost in the cultural use of that phrase, is that for John, the darkness was not evidence of absence. It was evidence of proximity. He writes, and this is from the 16th century, from a man who was imprisoned, who was tortured for his faith, who wrote some of these words in a prison cell with no light. He writes that the soul in desolation is like a person whose eyes have not yet adjusted to a very bright room. The darkness they experience is not because the light isn't there. It's because the light is so close, so overwhelming, that their vision hasn't caught up yet. That image, I need you to hold that image, because there's something happening underneath your waiting, underneath your faithfulness that feels unrewarded, underneath your prayers that seem to dissolve before they hit the ceiling, that you cannot see yet, not because it isn't there, because you are too close to it, because the light is so near that your eyes, which are trained to see in the dark, have not yet learned to see in this brightness. The birds don't worry about whether the light is coming. They simply exist in the morning, and the morning comes. But we are not birds, and Jesus knows that, and that's precisely why he doesn't leave us with the birds. There's a moment in the passage that most readers skip past, a moment so quiet, so understated, that you have to slow all the way down to catch it. Jesus says, after the birds, after the lilies, after the whole architecture of his argument about divine provision, he says, Your heavenly Father knows that you need these things. That word, knows, not will figure out, not might notice, not cares about in a general cosmic sense. Knows, present tense, active, specific. The Greek is oidon, a word that means knowledge that comes from intimate, direct, personal experience. Not knowledge the way you know a fact, knowledge the way you know a person, knowledge the way you know the sound of your child's cry in the middle of the night, the specific pitch that means this is serious versus this is a nightmare versus this is nothing. Your Father knows you that way. He knows the specific weight of what you are carrying. He knows the exact shape of the thing you have been praying about. He knows how long it has been. He knows what it has cost you to keep trusting. He knows, and this is the part that will either break you open or that you will choose not to believe. He knows things about your situation that you do not know. He is not confused by what is happening to you. He is not surprised. He is not scrambling. He knows. And this is where the story of Hagar becomes not just background, but the whole point, because remember what God said to her in that desert, in that desperation, in that moment when she had walked away from her own dying child because hope had become too painful. God said, I have heard, not I will hear, not I heard eventually when things got bad enough. I have heard, past tense with ongoing present effect. In the Hebrew, this is what grammarians call the perfect tense, an action completed in the past whose results are still fully active in the present. God had been hearing Ishmael's voice the entire time Hagar was walking away. The hearing didn't start when she cried out. The hearing was already happening. Her despair had no effect on God's attentiveness. Her giving up had no effect on God's engagement. She sat under her grief and believed herself to be alone, and the entire time, God was already listening. This is what Jesus is invoking when he says, your Father knows. He is saying, you are not informing him. You are not waiting for him to notice. You are not hoping that your prayer breaks through some celestial bureaucracy. The knowing is already happening. It has been happening since before you felt the need. And the division, the marim now, the splitting, the thing that has been tearing you in half, it is not something God is indifferent to. It is not something he is asking you to resolve on your own before he steps in. The division itself, the very fact that you are split, the very fact that you're here watching this right now, that is part of how the hearing works. That is part of how the knowing expresses itself. God leads people to the thing they need through the pain of not yet having it. I want to say something now that might be the most important thing I've said, and I want to say it as directly as I know how. If you have been waiting, if you have been faithful and worn out and quietly losing the argument with yourself about whether any of this is real, if you have prayed the same prayer so many times that the words have gone hollow, if you have believed and doubted and believed again, and the thing you're believing for still hasn't come, Jesus is not telling you to feel less. He is not telling you to suppress the fear, to perform peace, to pretend the division isn't there. The command is not feel better. The command, the present imperative, the stop what you are doing right now, is a redirection of the eyes. Look at what is actually in front of you, not the feared future, not the painful past. Here, now, this moment, this breath, because in this moment, this exact one, you are cared for. The air in your lungs is not something you manufactured. The fact that your heart is beating is not a project you manage. The fact that you woke up this morning and are somehow still here, still believing, still in this conversation with God even when it hurts, that is not nothing. That is provision you haven't been counting because it arrived so quietly. The birds don't have to understand the mechanism of their feeding to be fed. You don't have to understand the mechanism of God's care to be cared for. And here, finally, here, after everything we've walked through together, here is the withheld thing. The piece I told you about at the beginning, the thing that makes everything else cohere. When Jesus says, seek first the kingdom, when he says this is what should come before everything else, he is not giving you another item for the to-do list. He is not asking you to add one more thing to the exhausting project of being a faithful person. He is removing something. He is saying the division you are feeling, the split, the merim now, is happening because you are trying to manage two kingdoms simultaneously. You are trying to take care of the kingdom of God and take care of the kingdom of your own anxiety. You are trying to trust and control at the same time. And those two things cannot coexist. They will tear you apart if you keep trying. Seek first. Not seek also, not seek eventually, first, as in before you figure it out, before you see how it's going to work, before you have the evidence, before the answer comes. The seeking is the answer. The turning of the eyes, the deliberate, sometimes agonizing choice to look at the birds, to look at the lilies, to look at what is actually present rather than what is feared or longed for, that act is not passive. That act is the most active, most muscular, most faith-requiring thing a human being can do. Hagar in the desert lifted her eyes, and there was a well. There had always been a well. She simply could not see it until she looked. The thing you have been praying about, I don't know what it is. I don't know how long it has been. I don't know what it has cost you, but I know this. The well is not absent. The knowing of your Father is not suspended. The hearing has been happening the entire time, and the invitation, not the command, not the theological principle, but the personal invitation from the person who made you and knows your name, is simply this. Stop dividing yourself. Lay down the part you've been carrying that was never yours to carry. Not because the fear isn't real, not because the need isn't real, but because there is a Father who knows, who has always known, who led you here through everything to this exact moment of understanding, and he has never once looked away. I want to ask you something before you go, not rhetorically. Actually, what has God brought you through that you still don't fully understand? What is the thing in your story that you're still holding, still carrying, that you haven't been able to make sense of yet? Write it below. Type it out. Someone is going to read those words tonight at 2 in the morning when they need to know they're not alone. Someone is going to see what you went through, and it is going to be the thing that keeps them here. Your pain has a purpose you haven't seen yet, because that's how this works. That's what Hagar discovered in the desert. That's what Jesus knew when he looked at that divided, desperate, beloved crowd. The thing that breaks us is almost always the thing that becomes the well for someone else. You were led here for a reason. The seeking brought you somewhere, and wherever you go from this moment, whether the thing you've been praying about comes tomorrow or whether you're still in the waiting, you go as someone who is known, completely, specifically, incomparably known. That changes everything, not all at once, but it changes everything.